Yo, what's going on, everybody? This is Nothing But Bangers, aka MBB, aka Bangers, aka the leaker was correct. I know it's shocking, but this person was actually correct. And Gen 4 seems to be what's on the menu for the newest Pokemon TCG Pocket set. Now, in this video, I'm not going to show you the trailer because I'm sure you've already seen it a million jillion times. So what I'm going to do is go into each of the cards. I've got a tier list of these cards, and I've got some spicy decks that you can be ready to try day one, or maybe you take one of the ideas and cook with it yourself, but let's get to it. So a big shout out to Pokemon Zone for getting these card images up on their website, and I'm going to go over each of these cards individually, but I wanted to just kind of introduce all of them to you. First, you've got Dialga EX, Palkia EX, you've got Lucario that was revealed in the trailer. You've also got Turtwig, which has 80 HP for a basic, which is pretty thick. Especially when you compare it to the other starters, which I think the highest had been 70 before. And then you got Chimchar, you've got Piplup. Then going down here, you've got Cynthia, which was revealed as well in the trailer. You've got Gibble, which interestingly enough does have a colorless energy for an attack. So we're not exactly sure how many different energy types may be needed for Garchomp, which is a very big point. We've seen fighting types on Garchomps before, and then we've seen other types as well, so it'll be interesting to see in terms of energy cost. And then you've got Pachirisu EX, which mentions something very unique on that card text. We also see Leafeon, Honchkrow, and Cresselia. So I'm going to spend most of the time talking about some of these cards, but I will not spend individual time on Turtwig, Chimchar, Piplup, or Gibble, seeing as we don't know what they're evolving into, okay? And nobody's probably playing just the basics in their deck from those four, right? They're playing the evolution. So we'll hold off on talking about those individually, but I'm going to give you my thoughts on each of these cards, and then again I've got a tier list ranking these cards, as well as some deck list and engines or splashes or whatever you want to call them, who cares. But let's get into it. So let's get into Dialga. So Dialga EX is going to be a basic steel type with 150 HP for 2 energy. It's going to deal 30 damage, but it's going to be able to take 2 still energies from your energy zone and attach to one of your bench Pokemon. The second attack is going to be heavy impact. It's only going to deal 100 damage for 4 energy, but it's 2 steel type energies or 2 metal energies and 2 colorless. The retreat cost is 2, and the weakness is actually fire. I think that they might have rushed that a little bit, copy pasted, but on the card you can see it's clearly fire. So let's kind of talk about this card and then some of the different synergies. So the first thing that kind of stands out is the fact that this is ramp, right? And usually ramp is something that's pretty good. I think every ramp card in the game has been pretty good, at least in some different variants, right? So when I take a look at Dialga, the first thing that I think of is kind of like a Lilligant, which is a grass stage 1 Pokemon, and for 2 energy it deals 50, and it ramps 1 grass energy to one of your grass Pokemon on the bench, if I remember correctly. So this is kind of an offset of that. Now obviously 2 energies is a little bit more of a steep cost, and it could be something that maybe is a little bit slow. However, if you combo it with Pokemon that are colorless, and you might be able to attack very early with those Pokemon. Also, with that 2 retreat cost, this Pokemon is just begging to be comboed with Leaf. So I think that you're going to see a potential engine where it's Dialga, Leaf, Druddigon. I almost want to call it like D&D, right? Because you're using Dialga and Druddigon, and then you're using Leaf to kind of keep things together, right? But that's still pretty bulky in terms of like a retreat cost, but I do have that as a little bit of an engine in one of the decks that I've got. I also do think that because Dialga puts it on any of the Pokemon on your bench, there is potential for stuff like Wigglytuff EX, Pidgeot, and Pidgeot EX. I do think that there's some potential with Mew EX as well as Tauros, and that's from the Mythical Island Tauros. So the way I look at this card is I do think that like in the future it could be better as well. Like there's so many ways that this card could become very, very good, and then like there's some ways that this deck or this card could be playable in a specific deck. But again, like when you're being able to ramp 2 energy and deal 30 damage, which is sort of like chip damage in some cases, I do think that that has potential. And I do think that Dialga is something that people may not think is very good right off the bat. But as more people cook with it, as more Pokemon are released in the future potentially as well. And keep in mind, we don't know the rest of the set. I mean, there's so many cards that we still don't know about. But again, this just kind of gets our wheels going in our head and kind of just makes us cook a little bit. But I do think Dialga EX is actually a good card. And again, it's just going to depend on what partners can you pair with it, right? But again, Wigglytuff, Pidgeot, you know, the EXs and the base Pidgeot, again, Mew EX and Tauros, I think are all cards that could potentially pair with it. And then like if you wanted to do dual type, maybe there's something with this and like the Executor from Mythical Island that only requires 1 grass type. But again, I don't like dual types as much, especially in the current way that they are implemented in the game. So I think that strictly colorless and psychic type Pokemon that have like attacks like Mew EX are probably the best way to go with this Pokemon as of right now. Now, moving on to Palkia EX. So Palkia EX is a card that a lot of people are going to write off because they read that second attack and they're like, oh, I'm never using that. So just for a second, ignore the second attack, okay? Ignore the second attack, all right? So Palkia EX is 150 HP. For 1 energy, it can deal 30 damage. It's 2 retreat costs, and the weakness is electric, right? So if you look at this card, trade Druddigon out of the current Gyarados deck and put in Palkia EX. So instead of stalling and like walling with Druddigon and your Pokemon, you know, potentially just like getting sniped on the bench by Hitmonlee and Zebstrika, imagine you have Palkia EX instead, and for 1 energy, you can put that Hitmonlee on a clock. For 1 energy, you can put that, you know, Hitmonlee or, you know, whatever on a clock. And that's kind of the way that I envision this Palkia. Now, there's going to be blowout games where all of a sudden you misty your Palkia and like, oh man, I guess I'm going to hit you for 150, I guess, you know, and like that's going to be actually busted. The other thing to think about too, when you talk about Palkia EX is even if you do the final attack for 150, which again, I haven't read that attack, but for 4 energy, it's going to discard 3 water energy from this Pokemon. This attack does 20 damage to each of your opponent's bench Pokemon. So it's dealing bench damage, right? So think of it as like a kind of a blizzard attack, right? But keep in mind, you're discarding 3 energy. You still have 1 left. So you could potentially, in a span of 2 turns, deal 150 and then 30, right? So keep that in mind when you're kind of evaluating this card. And again, the 2 retreat costs, it is a lot. But with cards like Leaf for Mythical Island, you are able to pivot in and out of the active spot. And again, if you just substitute Druddigon out and put in Palkia, it sort of fixes some of the issues that Gyarados EX has, right? Where like basically, you know, Greninja can't really deal with stuff for the whole game on its own. So when your Magikarps are getting sniped, you know, it's kind of just like, well, I guess I lose. But Palkia kind of gives you an alternate win condition in that Gyarados deck that I think is going to slide right in and be a good alternate win condition, as well as a card that basically does what Druddigon was trying to do in a lot of cases. Now, the big drawback is you are going to have to attach an energy to it. So, like, yeah, you're losing a turn powering up your Magikarp for Gyarados. So that's a big drawback. But again, like, just over a span of 2 turns, if your opponent is attacking your Druddigon, you're dealing 40 damage for no energy, right? But with Palkia, over those 2 turns, you're potentially using 1 energy, but you're dealing 60 damage, right? So again, it's fascinating to look at this, but I do think that Palkia EX has a lot of potential in that Gyarados deck. Now, there's also some other brews where Palkia EX might just kind of slide right in, and maybe we'll talk about those a little bit later in the video. The next card that I want to talk about is Lucario. And by the way, this art looks tremendous. One of the best arts that we've seen in Pokemon TCG Pocket. Man, if this card was printed in real life, I know a lot of people would want it. But Lucario is going to be a Stage 1 Pokemon with 100 HP with the ability Fighting Coach. And what that does is it's going to be able to boost all of the attacks used by your fighting Pokemon plus 20 damage to your opponent's active Pokemon. So one first thing to point out, if you have Hitmonlee, it's not going to boost the Hitmonlee because Hitmonlee only deals damage to the bench type. However, Hitmonchan might be a little bit of a solid Pokemon. Like Hitmonchan with Lucario is basically a just straight up upgrade of Farfetch'd, right? You're dealing, for 1 energy, you're dealing 30 damage with Hitmonchan, and then when you boost it with Lucario, you're doing 50. So if on curve, like if you go first and you have Hitmonchan, Riolu on the bench, by your turn 2, you're putting 50 damage for 1 energy of pressure on your opponent's Pokemon. Now, is that going to erase a Mew EX, or excuse me, or a Mewtwo EX? That gets a little dicey. But then cards like Marshadow can slide right in there, and I've got a deck like this ready to go and show you at the end. But Marshadow can kind of be that X factor that makes the math go right. So Lucario also, it looks like with this current text, it will stack its ability. So, like, that's huge, right? So if you have 2 Lucarios, you're dealing an extra 40 damage to your opponent's active Pokemon. Now, the retreat cost is 2, and for 2 energy, it deals 40. But keep in mind, it will boost its own attack. So because it boosts its own attack, it's 2 energy for 60, which is actually better than Mewtwo EX. So, hey, take that for what you will. I do think that fighting decks have a lot of potential. One of the big issues you're going to run into with fighting decks is space. There's not enough space for a lot of these Pokemon that you want to put in. You can't fit in Lucario, Hitmonchan, Hitmonlee, Marshadow, and Primeape. Like, the deck just has too many Pokemon, so you have to figure out what to cut. But again, this card I do think is arguably one of the best cards that we've seen in the reveal so far. And if you stay tuned to the end, you'll see where I rank it on my tier list. But again, Lucario, really good card in my opinion. And depending on how many good fighting Pokemon we see in this set, it could be the best card in the set. Like, it legit could be the best card in the set. One big curveball to look out for if we get a big basic fighting EX. If we get a big fighting basic EX, like a 150 HP fighting EX, or even a 130 basic fighting EX, like, that is going to be something to look out for, because if it's attacking for 1 energy, Lucario and that card is going to have some great synergy, because you would assume it's going to deal anywhere from 30 base damage to maybe even 50 base damage for its first attack. So keep your head on a swivel for a potential boost to the fighting types, especially if we see a big basic EX that is fighting type. So Cynthia, when I first read this card, I was like, oh my gosh, dude, 50 extra damage. Like, that's crazy. So what this is doing is, as a supporter, during your turn, attacks used by your Garchomp or Togekiss are going to deal 50 extra damage to your opponent's active Pokemon. So keep that in mind. It's only for active. But again, Garchomp and Togekiss, if you don't know, they're stage 2 Pokemon, right? So you got to keep that in mind. Like, this is a pseudo, like, stage 3 trainer, right? Because again, you're going to need Togepi, Togekiss, Togepi, Togetic, Togekiss, and then you're going to need Cynthia, right? If you're using Garchomp, you're going to need Gibble, Gabite, Garchomp, and then Cynthia to really boost this damage. But the trade-off for 50 damage is, like, insane. So, like, it really just depends on, like, what support we get for evolving Pokemon, and, like, if there's, like, any special balls that search out for evolution Pokemon, if there's any kind of rare candy or Pokemon breeder or Evo Soda. Like, there's a lot of cards that could make this more playable. But, like, right off the bat, I think that the only times you're going to lose to a card like Cynthia is when your opponent just draws, like, the Turbo Nuts, right? Like, they draw their stage 2 on curve. You know, they're able to pivot in and out of the active. So, like, maybe their Pokemon doesn't even have any damage on it, and then they just sweep you with their stage 2 and Cynthia, right? Like, that's definitely a possibility. But I think that, like, that's going to be more of a high roll game, because again, there's just a lot of conditions that have to be met for Cynthia to be good. But also, man, the art looks phenomenal. I definitely hope that I pull a full art Cynthia, even if it just sits in my collection, because, like, right now you can't trade full arts anyways. So Pachirisu EX is, like, really also another interesting Pokemon. Now, we weren't able to see all the stats on this Pokemon. I think that we may have seen the HP. I think it was like 130 or something, but I may be incorrect in that. I'm not sure if we saw that, because again, if PokeZone isn't updating the HP, then maybe we didn't see it. And For right now, what we are thinking this card does is that it deals 40 damage plus 40 more if it has a Pokemon tool attached to it. Now, this attack is going to cost 2 electric energies, right? So it's going to be something that's kind of like an alternate Pikachu attacker, right? If there's a Pokemon tool that says deal 10 extra damage each time this card attacks, you know, this is going to be dealing a potential of 90 damage on your turn 3, depending on like the, you know, if you went first and so on. So it's going to be up there with maybe Pikachu levels of attack. You could potentially see this card taking the spot of something like a Zapdos EX, although the fighting weakness does make it a little bit scary, especially depending on how much bulk it has. Like if it has 100 HP or like 110 HP, like dude, that might be too glassy and like you may not be able to play this card. But the other curveball again is, what are the Pokemon tools that we're gonna get? And there's so many Pokemon tools that we could get. Like it's not even worth me talking about all the different Pokemon tools right now. We'll save that for another video. But again, like right out the bat, like to really accurately judge this card, I need to know how glassy it is and like what Pokemon tools we're going to have. Like just kind of looking at it right now, I have no clue what to really think about this card. So it's just kind of like in the middle for me. Now let's check out some other cards. All right, Leafeon. Like this is the worst. Leafeon cut off right before we could see what the rest of the text does. Like we can't see it in like any of the other videos as well, because like there's multiple languages, and like in one of the trailers I think Honchkrow has one more retreat than it does in the English trailer. So like, hey, who knows? But like from what we can see, it's 2 energy and it deals 90 damage and it's got 90 HP. So it's a little glassy, right? Like you look at a stage 1 that has 90 HP and you're just like, oh, it's Pikachu food, right? So like that's a little glassy. Maybe it's nice on curve, like say you're going second, right? So say you're going second, so you're able to continuous tumble with your first attack, and then, you know, on your second turn you're able to evolve Leafeon, and then maybe you're dealing 90 consistently. Like that could be pretty good pressure. But again, like I don't know what the attack does. Like during your next turn, this Pokemon, what, right? Like what? Can it not attack or something? Like it can't be damaged by special effects? Like tell me, I need to know, right? So there's a lot of questions with this Pokemon. It's really hard to evaluate. But again, you can kind of see like the best case scenario is probably going second with this card, which, you know, is par for the course, right? Like most cards are like better when you go second. So let's keep going. So Honchkrow. So this is the card where, like, again, in like different trailers, it's got different retreat costs. I think I might have said that it had, in English trailer, it had 2 retreat cost or 1 retreat cost. In another trailer, I think it has 1 retreat cost. Like there's some weird discrepancy with Honchkrow. But looking at this card, 100 HP for a stage 1, interesting. Okay, you know, not super glassy, but not really like bulky. And then, you know, we don't know how much the attack cost. But basically, it's going to evolve for Murkrow, and it's going to say Skill Dive. It's going to deal, you know, 50 damage to one of your opponent's Pokemon. I'm guessing opponent's Pokemon, right? If it's specifically for the bench only, like that kind of stinks. Like you would want it to be any of your opponent's Pokemon in play. But also, it just kind of depends on like how expensive this attack is. If this attack is only 1 energy, like Honchkrow is really fascinating. 100% really fascinating. If it's 2 energy, okay, it's slightly less interesting. So we'll see how this goes. I think in the past, like unless this is just a direct upgrade from something like a Zebstrika, I think, or even a Lumineon, right? Unless it's 1 energy, I think if it's 2 energy, I mean, this is, you know, just kind of maybe a worse version than Lumineon. I mean, I guess Lumineon is glassier, right? And maybe has, you know, it just kind of depends on the weakness too, because apparently in the games, Honchkrow is not weak to, it's one of the types, right? Like I think it's like not weak to like fighting or something like that. But I think it may be weak to electric. I might have that flipped. But, you know, being a dark and a flying type, like, dude, it's got to be weak to either fighting or electric on the card game. So, like, we're just going to have to wait and see. And so, like, that might play a factor as well. So, again, Honchkrow, kind of interesting. But right now, I need to know how much the attack cost to really be able to accurately judge this card. Okay, Cresselia. So from what we've seen, we do think it has 110 HP and it's a basic Pokemon. For 2 Psychic Energy, it's dealing 50 and healing 20 from itself. So like this is a really fascinating card for specifically like the no EX format. There's maybe a chance that this card could like make like a Gardevoir, you know, Cresselia deck be viable in no EX, or like maybe in limited formats where like some EX Pokemon are banned, right? But outside of that, like Cresselia is like kind of awkward, right? Because it's not necessarily better than base Mewtwo, right? Like the non-EX Mewtwo, because it's not going to be able to one-shot Pikachu EX. It's not going to be able to one-shot things that are at like 130 HP with Giovanni, right? So like it can't even one-shot Mew, right? Like, in fact, I think Mew actually outraces Cresselia if it copies the attack, right? I guess it depends on, like, who gets the 2 energy. Like, if Cresselia gets 2 energy first, hits the Mew, maybe that changes the math a little bit. But again, like, there's just some weird interaction with Cresselia. But maybe it's better than something like a Jinx because it's slightly bulkier, so it's able to withstand Pikachu. And it could, you know, deal pretty good damage to Pikachu at 50 a pop. And then depending on like how many Pokemon your opponent has on the bench, like maybe it outraces the Pikachu. Depends on if you have Potion or Blue. Like there's a lot of questions here. But Cresselia is like, it's kind of interesting, but I think it's like maybe not as good as a base Mewtwo. And you know, that may slide right into these Mewtwo EX and Gardevoir decks. Now again, in alternate formats, hey, Cresselia might be an option. And again, like we're not sure like what the retreat cost is, so like that's a whole thing as well. Like, is it 1 retreat cost? Is it 2 retreat costs? Is it 3 retreat costs for whatever reason? Like, so a lot of questions still on this card, but it could be an interesting alternative in some of those psychic decks. So this is my way too early tier list for these cards, and like I'm gonna try to give you justifications for these cards and where they are currently evaluated. But let's start with the bottom, where it's just a category of basic. Like they're just basics. Like I have no idea like the evolutions of these, so it's really hard to evaluate. Then when you start getting into the C tier range, you've got Honchkrow, right? You got Cresselia and you got Leafeon. And, you know, like that's mostly due to the fact like there's some missing parts of those cards that is like really hard to evaluate right now. So, you know, hey, those cards could definitely move up depending on like retreat cost, depending on, you know, the rest of the text, depending on how pricey the attacks are. So like there's just conditions there. When you get to B tier, I've got Pachirisu EX, and like that's just because, again, or, you know, we're not necessarily sure, like, or Pachirisu, excuse me, we're not really sure like how good the Pokemon tools are, and then we're still kind of waiting to hear things on like bulk. But like I could definitely see Pachirisu moving up in this tier list, like 100%. And then with Cynthia, I've just kind of got it in the middle because again, we're just not sure like how bad the lines are for Togekiss and Garchomp, and then like we're not sure if there's rare candy, if there's some sort of evolution surge. So like I've just kind of got it like in the middle, right? And like honestly, like hey, it may slide down to C. Like it may be as like hard to play as something like a Brock is, right? So that's very possible. But hey, we'll give it B tier right now just because the art is phenomenal. Now, A tier. So this is where it starts to get spicy, and I've got Palkia in the A tier because look, if Druddigon was as good as it was, I think that Palkia definitely deserves to be rated in like not necessarily as good, but like kind of close, right? Because again, they're going to do two different things. You're not going to be able to splash Palkia in as many decks as you're able to splash Druddigon, but Palkia will slide into some decks and maybe even create some new decks in a very cool fashion, especially when you start cooking with it and, you know, other cards that we already have in the water type, like maybe even a Greninja. Like it's just, there's a lot of things that you can cook with. You know, I don't want to go too deep into those things because again, I don't want to necessarily share everything, but I want to give you some cool things that you can cook with on your own as well. Now, the other card that I have in A tier is going to be that Dialga, and again, that's because I see potential in Dialga immediately, and I see potential down the line with Dialga as well, because we may get better cards even outside of this set that work really well with Dialga. Now, the biggest weakness that you're going to be able to look at when you talk about Dialga and Palkia EX is that hit points. Like, the hit points being 150, like, just to be real, Mewtwo is still looking super spicy against both of those cards, right? Like, even with the fighting stuff that we've seen with Lucario, you're just like, well, Mew and Mewtwo, like, kind of just would feast on a lot of that stuff. So, like, you do have to keep that in mind, that 150 consistent damage from Mewtwo, if Gardevoir is online, is just, like, hard to beat, right? It's hard to power creep. So, like, as cool as Palkia and Dialga look, like, you're going to have to play them with something that can, like, fight back against something like a Mewtwo EX. And so, like, that's another reason why, like, hey, Palkia Gyarados, like, that's going to be able to answer, you know, a Mewtwo EX, you would imagine. And then when you start talking about Dialga, well, hey, stuff like Pidgeot EX can kind of answer Mewtwo in some scenarios. So, like, there's a lot of cookage there, okay? And then when you get to the best card in the trailer so far, in my opinion, I do think that Lucario has a lot of great tools with something like Marshadow, with something like Hitmonlee, and obviously Hitmonchan. And then who knows, somebody may figure out a way to, you know, work stuff out with Aerodactyl and Primeape, although I do think that space is so tight that I don't know how you do that without cutting some of the other Pokemon. And again, the big curveball is, hey, what about a big fighting EX Pokemon that's a basic, right? You pair that with Lucario, and fighting may be a force to be reckoned with, even though it already is, right? Like, it's already able to compete with some of the best decks in the game right now. But grass decks with Serebii, Erica, Executor give it a lot of problems, and psychic decks with Mew EX and Mewtwo EX can definitely give it some problems as well. So keep that in mind. But let's get to the most exciting part of the video. Let's get to some new cooks and some new engines.